deep in the Russian desert, 1,700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. A place that doesn't officially exist on any public military map. A place where Russia keeps its most terrifying weapons on standby, hidden inside reinforced hangars, surrounded by air defense rings, and protected by personnel that Moscow has never publicly acknowledged. This is Kapustin Yar. And in January 2026, Ukraine blew part of it to pieces. Explosion sound effect. Screen cut to black. No NATO ally gave them the missiles. No American general approved the target. This was Ukraine, operating alone. Striking the most sensitive missile site in all of Russian territory, the launchpad for Putin's so-called unstoppable weapon, the Oreshnik. This is the story of how it happened, why it matters, and why Moscow is still trying to pretend it didn't. To understand why hitting Kapustin Yar was so significant, you first need to understand what the Oreshnik actually is, and why Putin has been obsessed with it. The name means hazel tree in Russian, but there is nothing gentle about this weapon. The Oreshnik is an intermediate-range ballistic missile, an IRBM. It traces its DNA back to a Cold War-era Soviet project called the RS-26 Rubez, a program that was officially canceled in 2018 but never truly died. Russian engineers took that missile, stripped it of one of its booster stages, and transformed it into something new, something faster, something terrifyingly difficult to intercept. How fast? Mach 10. That's roughly 13,000 kilometers per hour. At that speed, the missile travels faster than any air defense system currently deployed in Europe can react to. NATO's Patriot batteries, Ukraine's own S-300 systems, even Germany's newly deployed Arrow 3. Interceptors, none of them were designed to stop something moving at 10 times the speed of sound on a steep re-entry trajectory. But the speed alone isn't what makes the Oreshnik so dangerous. What truly sets it apart is its warhead configuration. It carries multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs. 6 warheads, each warhead carrying 6 submunitions. These separate in flight, spreading across a wide target area, each falling like a hammer from the edge of space. Guided by inertial navigation, corrected by Russia's GLONASS satellite system. Before the Oreshnik MIRVs were only used on intercontinental nuclear missiles. Putin's engineers basically took a technology reserved for thermonuclear warfare and attached it to a conventional strike weapon. And here's the part that makes Western defense analysts lose sleep at night. The Oreshnik is nuclear capable. It can carry either a conventional payload or nuclear warheads. Putin has personally stated that even in conventional form, a salvo of Oreshniks could deliver destruction comparable to a nuclear strike. Whether that claim is true or propaganda is debated, but the psychological impact, that part is absolutely real. The world first learned the Oreshnik existed not from a press conference in Moscow, but from a fireball over the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. It was November 21, 2024. Ukrainian air defense operators were tracking what they initially believed was a standard ballistic missile, perhaps a Kinzel, perhaps an Iskander. The radar signature was unusual, but these crews had learned to act fast and ask questions later. Then something strange happened. The signature split, not once, multiple times. 6 warheads diverged from the main body, and each of those warheads released submunitions. The sky above Dnipro lit up like a firework display designed in hell. The target, Mach, Ukraine's largest rocket engine manufacturing plant, a facility that had been producing components for Ukrainian weapons programs. The missile hit. But when investigators reached the site, they found something unexpected. The warheads hadn't exploded. The submunitions were inert, dummy payloads, no explosives. Russia had sent its terrifying new weapon on a live-fire test against a real Ukrainian city, using real civilians as involuntary witnesses to a weapons demonstration. The message was unmistakable. Putin went on television within hours, confirming the strike personally, something Russian leaders almost never do. He stared into the camera and said, "Modern air defense systems cannot intercept Oreshnik missiles." He called it a response to Ukraine using American ATACMS missiles inside Russian territory. But everyone watching understood the real message. This is what we have, and you cannot stop it. The West was stunned. Ukraine was shaken. In Kapustin Yar, the secret test, range from which that missile had been launched, quietly moved to the top of Ukraine's target priority list. Within days of the Dnipro strike, Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, began a systematic effort to identify every aspect of the Oreshnik program. Where were the missiles stored? How many existed? Where was the launch infrastructure? How long did it take to prepare a missile for launch? What were the maintenance cycles? And most critically, where were the hangars? Ballistic missiles of the Oreshnik size don't just sit outside in the open. Before launch, they require what military planners call pre-launch preparation, a complex series of technical procedures conducted and climate-controlled. Reinforced hangar facilities, fuel loading, systems checks, warhead integration. This process takes hours. It requires specific infrastructure. At Kapustin Yar, commercial satellite imagery from Planet Labs, the same company whose images have repeatedly revealed Russian military movements throughout this war, began showing unusual activity. Cleared land, new construction. Structures consistent with missile processing and storage facilities. Ukrainian intelligence cross-referenced this imagery with signals intelligence intercepted communications, electronic emissions from the site, and crucially, human intelligence from an unlikely source, Russian opposition networks. The operation that would eventually strike Kapustin Yar was not a solo mission. Behind the scenes, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces coordinated with an organization called Chornaya Iskra, Black Spark, part of Russia's growing internal resistance movement. These were operatives inside Russia itself, monitoring the site's activity, tracking personnel movements, and feeding real-time intelligence back to Kyiv. Nobody in the West was supposed to know any of this was happening. Ukraine's military planners understood something critical early in 2025. If they wanted to strike deep inside Russian territory, beyond the range of the Western weapons Kyiv had received, they would need to build their own weapons. Enter Firepoint, a Ukrainian private defense company that had been quietly developing something remarkable. A cruise missile they called the FP-5 Flamingo. On paper, the Flamingo is a subsonic cruise missile, not hypersonic, not glamorous. But the specifications are extraordinary. The missile carries a 1,150-kilogram warhead, one of the heaviest conventional payloads on any cruise missile in existence. Its range exceeds 3,000 kilometers, meaning it can strike targets anywhere in the Russian Federation from well within Ukrainian airspace. And it flies at an altitude of just 50 meters above the ground, hugging the terrain to defeat radar coverage. By October 2025, The Economist reported that Ukraine had already begun operational use of the Flamingo against Russian targets. Firepoint's production rate was climbing, initially 2 to 3 missiles per day, with plans to reach 8 per day by year's end. President Zelensky would later publicly call the Flamingo the most successful Ukrainian-made weapon. But there was a problem nobody was supposed to know about. Russia found the production facility. In 2025, 2 major Russian missile strikes hit Firepoint's manufacturing sites. The company's co-founder later confirmed they lost 2 large workshops in what she described as very unpleasant attacks. The Flamingo program wasn't dead, but it was bleeding. Ukraine quietly relocated production, dispersed it, hardened it, and kept building, because they already had a target in mind. On the night of January 8th into 9th, 2026, Russia launched what its defense ministry described as a massive retaliatory strike against Ukraine. The stated reason? Moscow claimed Ukraine had attacked Putin's residence in Novgorod Oblast on December 29th. Both Kyiv and Washington flatly denied it ever happened. Even U.S. President Donald Trump, not known for his sympathy toward Ukraine, rejected the Russian claim entirely. The truth barely mattered to Putin. He had already made his decision. Russia fired 242 attack drones, 13 ballistic missiles, and 22 cruise missiles across Ukraine that night. It was one of the largest single-night barrages of the entire war. Kyiv was hit. The Qatari embassy in the capital was struck and damaged. At least 4 people were killed, 22 injured. And then the main event. From Kapustin Yar, launched across almost 1,600 kilometers of sky, an Oreshnik missile streaked toward the city of Lviv in western Ukraine. Lviv, not an industrial target deep in the country's interior. Lviv, a city of over 700,000 people. A city that had spent years as the safe part of Ukraine, as a refuge for millions of displaced families. The the gateway through which Western aid flowed into the country. A city just 70 kilometers from the border with Poland, a NATO member state, the Oreshnik struck infrastructure near the city. Satellite imagery later confirmed its characteristic pattern, 6 warheads spreading in flight, leaving multiple impact craters in a geographic cluster. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha immediately called it what it was. It's a grave threat to security on the European continent. The EU's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, declared the strike a warning to Europe and to the US. Britain, France, and Germany issued a joint statement calling it escalatory and unacceptable. But here is what nobody was saying publicly at that moment. Ukraine had already been planning its response for months, and Kapustin Yar was already in the crosshairs. Throughout January 2026, Ukraine conducted a series of strikes against the Kapustin Yar test range in Russia's Astrakhan Oblast. Not one strike, not two. A sustained, coordinated campaign targeting specific infrastructure at one of Russia's most sensitive military sites. The weapons used were Ukrainian-made Flamingo cruise missiles, operating alongside a broader mix of long-range drones and strike systems. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces coordinated with Black Spark operatives inside Russia, who continued monitoring the site's response, tracking personnel evacuations, logging changes in air defense posture, watching for signs of damage and adaptation. The strikes hit a complex of hangar-type buildings, specifically identified as facilities used for the pre-launch preparation of ballistic missiles, the critical infrastructure where Oreshnik missiles are readied before launch. Fueled, checked, armed, made ready to fly. Hit the hangars. Hit the preparation facilities. You don't just damage buildings, you disrupt the entire launch cycle. But Ukraine's generals understood something else. Kapustin Yar isn't just an Oreshnik site. It is one of Russia's primary test ranges for intercontinental ballistic missiles, part of the ground-based leg of Russia's nuclear triad. The Russian strategic rocket forces have used this range for decades. It is, in military terminology, a strategic asset. And Ukraine had just put it under attack with domestically built missiles. For weeks, the strikes were a secret. Ukraine said nothing publicly. Russia said nothing, which in itself was telling. A country that loses a supply depot in Belgorod shouts about it on state television within hours. But Kapustin Yar silence. Then, on February 5th, 2026, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces released a statement on Telegram. The message was measured, careful, but the content was explosive. Quote, during January 2026, Ukraine's defense forces carried out a series of successful strikes on hangar-type buildings where pre-launch preparations of medium-range intercontinental ballistic missiles were conducted at the Kapustin Yar test range in Russia's Astrakhan Oblast. The statement confirmed that at least one hangar was significantly damaged. Multiple other buildings suffered damage of varying degrees. Personnel had been evacuated from parts of the site. The strikes had used long-range Ukrainian-produced systems, including the FP-5 Flamingo. 3 days later, on February 8th, the General Staff released additional damage assessments. The strikes had hit not just hangars, but a technical facility used to service intermediate-range ballistic missiles, an assembly building, and a logistics warehouse. Think about what that means for a moment. Ukraine didn't just scratch the surface of Kapustin Yar. Ukrainian missiles reached into the operational heart of Russia's most protected IRBM facility, the place where Oreshnik missiles are assembled, serviced, and prepared to kill, and they tore pieces of it apart. In its daily combat summary, confirmed for the first time that Russian air defense systems had intercepted 5 Flamingo missiles, an implicit acknowledgement that the weapons are real, it's operational, and reaching deep into Russian territory. Fragments of one downed Flamingo were photographed and circulated online, showing a low-tech but functional airframe, a weapon built not for elegance, but for reach and payload. Meanwhile, in Munich at the annual security conference, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stood at a podium and confirmed what his general staff had announced. Ukraine had used Flamingo missiles. We had technical problems. One of our large production lines was destroyed by Russian missiles. I can talk about it now because the production has already been relocated, and it has been partially restored. Russia had found the factory. Russia had bombed it. Ukraine had quietly picked up the pieces, moved them, and kept building. The Flamingos that struck Kapustin Yar in January were produced at relocated, dispersed facilities that Russia hadn't yet found. Cat and mouse, strike and rebuild. This is the industrial war happening in parallel to the frontline war. For his part, former Ukrainian Deputy Chief of General Staff Lieutenant General Ihor Romanenko put it in the most memorable terms possible. On Ukrainian radio, he said, "The Ukrainian flamingo pecks the Russian Oreshnik, a hazel tree, pecked by a flamingo." Let us step back from the drama for a moment and examine what this operation actually means from a military standpoint, because the strategic implications go far beyond the physical damage to a few hangars. Point 1. Range. Kapustin Yar sits in Russia's Astrakhan Oblast, approximately 1,600 to 1,700 kilometers from Ukraine's launch positions. The Flamingo's stated range is over 3,000 kilometers. This means Ukraine now has a credible capability to strike nearly anywhere in the Russian Federation: Moscow, St. Petersburg, Siberian industrial regions. Any target within Russia's vast territory is now theoretically reachable. This is not a small thing. Knowing that Ukrainian missiles couldn't reach back, that calculation is changing. Point 2. Target selection. Ukraine didn't strike a random Russian oil depot or a rail junction. It struck a strategic nuclear asset, a test range for ICBMs and IRBMs. The message to Moscow was deliberate and precise. We know where your most sensitive facilities are. We can reach them, and we will. Point 3. Indigenous capability. The Flamingo is a Ukrainian-designed, Ukrainian-produced weapon. It doesn't require US approval. It doesn't require NATO authorization. Ukraine can build it, launch it, and own the decision to use it without asking anyone's permission. This matters enormously in a geopolitical environment where Western support has become increasingly uncertain and conditional. Point 4. The Oreshnik's limitations exposed. Remember what Russian General Romanenko pointed out, the Oreshnik? For all its terrifying speed and hypersonic re-entry vehicles, has a problem. Russia has only a handful of these missiles. They can't be repositioned easily. They're tied to specific launch infrastructure, the very infrastructure Ukraine just attacked. If Ukraine can consistently threaten and damage those preparation facilities, it makes every future Oreshnik launch more difficult, more expensive, and potentially less reliable. Point 5. Intelligence validation. The fact that Ukrainian missiles reached Kapustin Yar at all proves that Ukraine's intelligence network inside Russia is functioning at a high level. The coordination with Black Spark operatives, the satellite imagery analysis, the planning required to navigate Russian air defenses and strike specific buildings within a defended installation. This takes months of preparation and exceptional intelligence work. Someone is watching Russia from the inside, and Russia cannot stop them. Not everyone is convinced Ukraine's strikes were the total success Kyiv's general staff claimed. One American satellite imagery analyst, Decker Evelith, published a detailed counter-analysis online, arguing that the imagery circulating as proof of Ukrainian strikes actually showed no structural damage to Kapustin Yar's buildings. He pointed to higher-resolution satellite photographs taken in the days following the strikes and said, in direct terms, "They are seeing smoke from the station's power plant operating normally. There is no damage to the facility." His assessment was widely circulated, particularly in pro-Russian and Western skeptic circles. But here's where it gets complicated. First, Ukraine's own general staff subsequently released additional, more detailed damage assessments on February 8th, confirming strikes on the servicing facility, the assembly building, and the warehouse. These weren't vague claims. They named specific building functions. Second, Russia's own behavior tells a story. Moscow didn't immediately resume Oreshnik launches after January. A country sitting on a fully functional, undamaged launch site has no operational reason to pause. The silence is informative. Third, even President Zelensky explicitly referenced the Kapustin Yar strikes at the Munich Security Conference, a venue where Ukrainian officials generally cannot afford to make false claims in front of allied defense ministers, who have access to their own satellite intelligence. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Some damage occurred. Some facilities were affected. Whether the critical pre-launch preparation hangars were destroyed or merely degraded is a question that may not be fully answered for months. War information is always incomplete, always contested, and always serves someone's narrative. What is not in dispute? Ukrainian missiles reached Kapustin Yar, for a country fighting with one hand behind its back for 3 years. That alone is a statement that changes the calculus of this war. The Oreshnik was Putin's ultimate psychological weapon, his trump card. The weapon he waved at NATO like a hammer every time Western nations discussed expanding support for Ukraine. The message was always the same: if you push too far, we have something you cannot stop. That message has now been partially answered. Not with a Western weapon, not with an American ATACMS or a British Storm Shadow, with a Ukrainian Flamingo.
A bird that flies 50 meters above the ground, carrying over a ton of explosives, built in dispersed factories that Russia can't completely find or destroy.
For European NATO members watching this unfold, the implications are significant. The Oreshnik, deployed to Belarus in December 2025, can reach every NATO capital in Europe. That fact hasn't changed. But the knowledge that Ukraine can strike back deeply, specifically, into the heart of Russia's strategic missile infrastructure creates a new kind of deterrence that did not exist 6 months ago. For Russia, the problem is compounding. Its military is absorbing casualties at extraordinary rates on the front lines, with Western analysts estimating well over 1 million Russian soldiers killed or wounded since the war began. Its economy is strained by sanctions and war costs. And now its most prized weapons system is under threat at its home base, 1,700 kilometers from the front. The Oreshnik was supposed to be untouchable. Putin said so himself. He was wrong. There is a version of this war that happens on the front lines, in the trenches of Donetsk, in the mud near Zaporizhia, in the burned-out streets of Bakhmut and Avdiivka. That war is brutal, grinding, and measured in kilometers. But there is another war happening in the shadows, a war of satellites and signals, cruise missiles flying 50 meters above frozen Russian farmland in the dead of night, of operatives inside Russia feeding targeting coordinates to a Kyiv control room, of engineers rebuilding bombed factories in undisclosed locations, machining warheads and programming guidance systems in secret. In this shadow war, Ukraine just scored something remarkable. A country that was told it could unsurvive the Oreshnik went out and struck the place where Oreshniks are born. Nobody was supposed to know it happened. Ukraine made sure the world found out. Putin built a weapon he claimed was impossible to answer. Ukraine built an answer anyway. The answer is called the Flamingo. It costs a fraction of what the Oreshnik costs. Ukraine is producing more of them every month. And while Russia has only a handful of its fearsome hypersonic missiles, Ukraine has runway, industrial runway, to scale. The Flamingo hasn't won this war. It hasn't ended the Oreshnik threat. Russia still has its missiles. Russia is still launching attacks. The front lines are still bleeding. But something has changed. A line has been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. Ukraine reached into the sovereign territory of the Russian Federation past its air defenses, past its radar networks, past everything Moscow built to keep Ukrainian weapons away from its most precious assets, and it hit exactly what it aimed at. That is a message that no amount of Russian state television can erase. It is a fact. And facts, in this war, are the most dangerous weapons of all. So here's the question that every military analyst in Washington, London, Brussels, and Moscow is now asking themselves. If Ukraine can hit Kapustin Yar with a handful of Flamingo missiles today, what happens when they have 50? 100? What happens when Russia can't rebuild its Oreshnik preparation facilities faster than Ukraine can destroy them? And what happens to Putin's nuclear signaling, its ultimate psychological weapon, if the world comes to understand that the unstoppable Oreshnik can be stopped at the source? The Oreshnik was supposed to be Russia's answer to the question of Western escalation. Ukraine just asked a counter-question that nobody expected. We want to know what you think. Is this a turning point in the war? Has Ukraine changed the strategic balance by proving it can strike Russia's most sensitive sites? Or is this a dangerous escalation, one that could push Putin toward decisions that nobody wants to think about? Let us know in the comments below. And if this kind of deep-dive military analysis is what you're here for, hit that subscribe button, because the war in Ukraine is changing every single week, and we are not going to let you miss a single move. Drop a like if this video gave you the full picture. and share it with someone who thinks they already know this story because they don't. Till next time, stay sharp.